Hello, hello. This is TLC, and I decided that I'd kind of go back to to the basics here. There was a video I made a year or so ago, kind of right when I was just kind of exploring YouTube and decided to try my hand on it. Which was my argument as to what was, in my opinion, the best class in Dungeons and Dragons. And I decided, now that I'm kind of getting back in the swing of things, that I would create the antithesis, all right, the opposite, the opponent to the best class in D&D, and instead make a video creating in my mind, or arguing in my mind what the worst class in D&D 5th edition. Now, I'll be honest, this is entirely my opinion. All right, you are entitled to yours. You are more than welcome to debate me and disagree by all means. But hear me out. All right. And who knows, maybe by the end of the video, I'll have you convinced. So what is the absolute worst class here in D&D 5th edition? May surprise you, may not. And that is the Barbarian. The Barbarian is the worst class in D&D 5th edition. Now I hear you already talking, like, how can you say that? Look at its hit points, look at its pure damage, look at the fact that it's a tank and it's resistant to damage. You're right. For like maybe a few levels. Let's break these strengths down, right? Because these are always the things that the Barbarian, these are deemed strengths, and I agree that they are, but we have to keep them in the context of how long is it really a strength, right? Because that's the problem. Like, we can look at some of these things and go, okay, yeah, you're right, this is a strength for now, but at what point does it stop? At what point do other classes either meet it or begin to go beyond it? And what we find is this: is one, in terms of hit points, yes, at low levels, if you are rolling a d12 for your hit die and you have a decent decent con modifier, it is entirely possible that yes, you will have way more hit points than everybody else from we'll say tier 1, so levels 1 through 5, right? The problem is that D&D is a game of averages. It is it's a game where the longer it goes on, especially when we're talking about die rolls like ability checks, hit points, things like that, skill checks, the more you roll, the closer to average you get. And what I mean by that is that, okay, let's take, for instance, say you have a fighter in a party and a barbarian. Now, the average on a d12 is a 7. Average on a d10 is a 6. Now, let's go ahead and say here that since you are a barbarian, con is like your second highest number, right? Your biggest number is your strength, your second is your con. So let's say you have a con modifier of +2, maybe +3. Okay. Let's say a fighter does basically the same thing. Okay, fighter's best is its strength, and its second best is its con. So it also has a +2 and +3. By level 5 or 6, if you take the average of them, as you get closer and closer to rolling the average of the two dice, what you find out is by tier 2 and tier 3, there might only be 20 hit points or so separating the fighter and the barbarian, which maybe doesn't sound like a lot, but you got to keep in mind here, when you're in tier 2, tier 3, you're fighting enemies that are going to be doing 30 something points of damage. So that 20 points isn't even enough to, survive an extra hit fully. And so, just as this goes on, you notice that these classes that use d10s and a decent con are going to basically be right up there with you. The second point, which is the pure damage. Okay, yes, 100%, you get to use, your lovely little bonus there. When you are raging, you get that +2, +3, whatever. Here's the problem, though, is one, that damage does not scale very well. I don't care. This to me is one of, like, if I was trying to fix the barbarian, one of the first things I would do is I would increase all those numbers and be willing to say that, yeah, my barbarian at first tier is going to absolutely, smash anything, that I throw at it, from levels 1 to 4. But the problem is that because the barbarian never gets the ability to use magic, at some point, all your fighter needs to do is have the ability, and thanks to things like Tasha's, they get this ability pretty easily. All they need to do is have the ability to cast something like Hunter's Mark, or Hex, or Heroism, or Magic Weapon, or you see where this is going, right? There's a number of ways for that +2, like a +2 isn't even the average of a d6. There are so many spells in 5th edition where it says, hey, you cast the spell, it's concentration, and you get to add a d6 of something, right? A d6 of fire damage, a d6 of radiant damage, a d6 of necrotic damage, a d6 of force damage, whatever. The point is that +2 or +3 that a barbarian gets in its rage, that's not even the average of a d6. So as soon as these other melee classes have the ability to just, shoot out a single hex in a combat, they are now doing just as much, if not more damage than a barbarian. Now you can argue that, hey, well, they have to, expand a spell slot. They have to, do this thing. And you're right. But doesn't a barbarian have to use its rage? Doesn't a barbarian only have 2 rages until level, 4 or 5? Then it gets 3? In a way, you could argue that that's almost like a spell slot. That is the barbarian spell slot. It uses one of its 3 rages. And then that, so if your DM is notorious for having 4 or 5 combat sessions, or combat encounters in a single session, you may not have the ability to rage every single time. So that damage isn't even guaranteed. All right, third, the tank. The reason I say it is kind of a tank is because, and this is something I don't know if it's DMs, I don't know if it's players, maybe it's a combination of the two. We need to really read what it says there in the book under rage. Because if you read it, under rage, it only gives you resistance to piercing, bludgeoning, and slashing damage of non-magical weapons. If you want to actually be able to have all damage, you need to go the Totem of the Bear, which is exactly why the Totem of the Bear is the best barbarian class in the game. But the point, the fact of the matter is that, I think sometimes we see like, oh, resistant to damage, and we immediately think that, I think even, and don't quote me on this, I'm a huge Critical Role fan, but for some reason, I remember Travis Willingham's character, Grog Strongjaw, who was a barbarian. I remember him being able to take half damage in a couple of things, in a couple of instances where I don't think he should have been able to. Granted, I don't exactly remember what kind of barbarian he was. Maybe he was a Totem of the Bear barbarian, but I don't think he was. But I just remember him, getting doused in Dragonfire and Acid and being able to take half damage on those things. And that's not how that works. Barbarians are everyone thinks, like, oh, Barbarian is resistant to all these different types of damages. That's only Bear. So as soon as, your enemies, as soon as you reach, say, tier 2, tier 3, where it would be more common for your party to run up against, magical creatures, magical damage, magic items, even if it's just a +1 dagger, that's all it takes. And now that completely overrides that resistance. So, the point is that these are strengths, but the point is once you get outside of like tier 1, once you get, level 6 and above, these aren't that strong anymore, which is exactly why the list of weaknesses is much more prevalent. Which, speaking of weaknesses, what is a barbarian weak to? Well, everything else. First off, they have no magical ability. And in addition, and I think we can all agree, DMs, players alike, 5th edition is the magical edition. It is the edition where this is the book, this is the time period of D&D where if you don't have the ability to cast magic, you are at a loss. Again, to go back to something that I feel like a lot of people in this community, we've watched them, we know them, or at the very least we've heard of them. Critical Role, Matt Mercer, Critical Role. This idea that barbarians are so susceptible to magic and cannot cast it themselves, I think that played out so perfectly in one of they had like a big battle royale, and literally like half the fight, Grog Strongjaw is just running around, and everyone is like terrified of getting anywhere near him because they know he can pump out lots of damage, which, by the way, is mostly thanks to the fact that Matt was very giving when it came to magic items and things like that. But here they were terrified, except for the spellcaster. The spellcaster just looked at him, snapped her fingers, and he died in the plane of water, and that was it. One failed save is all it takes to make this, this supposed amazing tank into nothing. And the fact that they themselves cannot cast magic, the fact that a barbarian can never use something like, say, a hex, or a hunter's mark or something, because it says when raging, you cannot concentrate or cast spells. In addition, in an addition where spells are everything, where magic is constantly power creeping higher and higher, the fact that this class not only, it seems to be susceptible to magic, and we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second, but cannot use it physically, it's being left in the dust. Secondly, subclasses that don't help. Odds are, if you're watching this video, you have probably at some point Googled what is the best subclass of this other class, right? And we've all seen those charts, the color coded, hey, if it's bright blue or silver or gold, and then it's like the best class, and then, the tiers of the colors afterwards. Okay, really cool. I enjoy reading them. When you look at other classes, like say the Paladin or the Wizard or the Bard, you will find that there are subclasses in which half of them are in the top two colors. Half of them are dark blue, half of them are bright blue. There's maybe one that's less than mediocre, but everything else is top. When you look at the Barbarian subclasses, almost all of them are mediocre or less. There's only like 3 that are above what we would what we would deem as mediocre. And the reason is because the subclasses just don't work. Either they don't build off of each other. They just seem like a weird, Frankenstein mix of abilities that just seem kind of randomly put together, like say the Berserker Barbarian. Or they tried to come up with something unique and cool, only to remember that, oh yeah, shit, this is supposed to be a class that can't actually use magic, so we're gonna make it do wild, kooky, crazy things, but only when it rages, which means only when it, goes into combat, which could be twice a day, maybe. Looking at you, Wild Magic Barbarian. And that's the problem here, is the fact that, so many of these subclasses, they just don't work well. They just don't, seem to be able to meld and stick with what the Barbarian was good at. But also evolve it so as all the other classes in D&D are, experiencing this power creep and are getting better and better, the Barbarian subclasses just seem to be either lackluster or just falling behind. Third, and this is something that gets kind of overlooked, I think that this is something that is a problem with the mechanic of the Barbarian, the way it is designed, and that is that you have to spread your ability scores too far. If you want to have a good wizard, the only thing you need to have is a good intelligence. If you have other good stats, that's great. But odds are the only stat you actually need is a good intelligence. If you want to be a good warlock, the only thing you need is a good constitution and a good charisma. That's it, maybe 2. Now you could argue something like, say, the Paladin. The Paladin can sometimes be a little thin in terms of ability scores, especially if it's trying to go for, a strength, con, and charisma. But I also think that that's how come so many pallies always end up multi-classing into Warlock, so that they can they can stop being split. That way they only need to focus on charisma and constitution. Point is that other classes have adapted and have been able to learn that, hey, there's only 2 ability scores I need to be great. The rest, as long as they don't suck, I'll be fine. The problem with the Barbarian is that you need 3. Now, you may not think that that having that 3rd ability score, being decent, you wouldn't think that would be a problem, but think of where those stats are going. In order to be a decent paladin, you need to put some points in your charisma. But when you put your points in charisma, you're not hurting yourself in any one direction. Here's what I mean. If I'm a paladin and I decide, I reach level 4 or 8 or whatever, all right, and I get my ability score improvement, I decide to, increase my charisma by 2. By doing that, I am increasing my DC. I am increasing, my spell attack if I have. I don't know if there's any paladin spell attacks, but if there is, I'm increasing it by 1 now. I am increasing, the ability. I think that there's a couple of abilities that what is it? The shield of ability, the aurora ability, where it's like, I get to cast this, so many times a day, equal to my charisma modifier, things like that. My point is I'm helping myself in combat, but I'm also helping myself outside of combat by increasing my charisma. My deception's better, my persuasion's better, I'm better at talking, I'm able to, by putting a point in my charisma, I am both assisting myself in combat and also out of combat. Same with Warlock. If let's take something completely different. Let's say, for instance, let's go back to the Wizard. All right, I increase my intelligence, increasing my spell attack, increasing my DC, increasing how many spells I can know. That's all combat. What about outside of combat? Okay, well, I'm increasing my investigation. Maybe I may not be the face of the group, but I can be the historian. I can be the person who's doing the research. I can be the person who investigates the room. There's by increasing my intelligence, I am assisting myself both in and out of combat. What the fuck does a barbarian have? If I decide to change my strength from an 18 to a 20, what am I assisting in? Just combat. If I decide to increase my dexterity so that my AC is better, I am just assisting in my combat. Constitution, just combat. Let's say I decide to be really weird and I'm like, I'm going to raise my charisma because I want to be a better talker. I get nothing in combat. Now I've gone, the pendulum has gone full swing. Now I'm only assisting myself out of combat. There's nothing helping, that doesn't assist me at all. And that's why, that's what I mean when I say that the barbarian stats are spread too thin. By choosing barbarian, you are accepting that the best score you have is probably going to be in either your strength or your con. Your second best is going to be in the opposite. Your third is probably going to be your dex. Your fourth is probably going to be either intelligence or wisdom, depending on how you want to role play. And then your last 2 dump stats are probably your charisma, and then one of the other 2 mental stats. You will never participate in anything outside of combat. Again, I go back to Critical Role. Travis Willingham, love him to death. He plays Grog Strongjaw, who he himself said that, he loved Grog, he loved the character. He fully admitted, he said, I felt useless out of combat. He said, I love Grog, but damn, I wish I could cast spells. Which is why he made Ford going into campaign 2. And I think that this is the stem of it. I think, this is the mechanical issue with the barbarian. The fact that, right out of the gate, you are so hyper focused on combat stuff that as soon as you get into a couple of sessions where combat isn't the thing, I'm not saying you can't do it. I'm not saying you won't be the one doing investigating. I'm not saying you can't be the one who's going to do the talking of the group and things like that. All I'm saying is that you're not going to be very good at it. You may cost your group, clues or money or, the ability to talk their way in and out of things. And I don't know. Maybe your group is different. All I know is in my group, if I was if I was not the best at what I needed done, I probably wouldn't be the one doing it. All right, no multiclassing ability. The fact that the only reason you would multiclass into Barbarian is to get its rage, but by raging, I cannot be wearing heavy armor. So there goes my fighters. There goes some of my cleric classes. Basically, there goes my paladin class probably. So I can't be wearing heavy armor, or I can't rage. I now have to use a strength based weapon. So if I was a dex build of any kind, no point in going into that. And of course, I have no magical ability. So really, the only class that benefits, the only two classes maybe that benefit by multi-classing in a barbarian is a fighter and a monk. That's it. All the others you lose more than you gain. And the monk, I do believe, I think that it's unarmed attacks. I'm pretty sure, I'll have to double check. I'm pretty sure they are required to use your dex stat. And their DCs for their monk abilities require your wisdom. And again, odds are your wisdom is probably your fourth highest stat. So it's probably like a 10, an 11 maybe. The multiclassing ability here sucks. Lastly, easily overcome. That is exactly, all of these points. All of these super awesome strengths. Once you get outside of, levels 1 to 5, each one of these things gets beaten. Your hit points eventually gets maxed by a fighter who has a decent constitution. Your pure, the damage that you output is immediately toppled by literally a paladin who can cast holy weapon. And as for you being a tank, great. You can be a tank for damage that isn't magical, and isn't some kind of, magic weapon of some sort. So even though it has all these strengths, it gets easily overcome. And lastly, and this is one that maybe is disagreed the most, this should be the class that dies every single combat. If I was a DM and I am running an enemy who has any intelligence score above like a 9, if my enemy knows that, oh look, this big broody dude with the big axe who keeps trying to chop me up, he's the front line. Everyone else is kind of sitting in the back, trying to, pepper me with arrows or spells. This dude with the axe is the only dude who seems to actually be like trying to, come at me and kill me. Why the hell are they just dropped to 0? If I had an enemy who had any intelligence above an 8 or a 9, I would tell the player, like, hey, as soon as he's knocking you down, he is cutting off your head. Like, he will take his whole next turn to deliver those 2 death saving throws, by attacking your unconscious corpse. Because you're the biggest dude here. There's no reason not to. So in my, when you get into, and again, this is something that, maybe at tier 1, it wouldn't happen too often because odds are, you're using enemies that can only attack once, but in tier 2 or tier 3, when you start having enemies who can attack 2 times, 3 times more, like, as soon as that barbarian goes down, that your enemy should be like, hey, you're the dude with the big axe who's been chopping my leg off for the last, 12, 18 seconds. I'm ending you now. Like, I am tearing you apart. So in theory, this class should be the one that gets killed in literally every single combat session. And I just, there's no, I can never understand why a DM, after they down a player, like a barbarian, unless the creature is unintelligent, then maybe. But I don't know. Just all of these things stacked together is why the barbarian is the worst class, in my opinion. Now, does that mean you can't have fun? No. All right. If you're someone who just wants to go around and turn things into paste for a little while, then yeah, the barbarian is amazing, especially at tier 1. If you're going to go play a campaign where, there's a lot of combat and most of it's going to be happening in tier 1 of play, so levels 1 through 5, go play barbarian and you will make paste. All right. You will upstart every single person. All right. No class will touch you. But if you're someone who's like, hey, I want to be able to play something that can be useful in and out of combat, and I don't want to just, have my mental stats be just things that the DM can just flick with a fingernail and just have, and immediately my, be charmed or be teleported or be, held personed or whatever, then go play a paladin. Go play a hexblade. Go seriously, go look and see what a hexblade, look at, go see how much damage a hexblade who can cast hex one time, go see how much damage they output, and then come back and tell me that you honestly want to play Barbarian. Especially if you're playing in a campaign where magic damage of some sort, whether from a weapon or from a spell, if that's a common occurrence, this guy's getting knocked down just as fast as anybody else, only he doesn't have any of the magic to back him up. So, this is my opinion. This is why I think all these weaknesses are why, my opinion, you are looking at the worst class of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. But hey, it's just my opinion. If you disagree, feel free. In the meantime, I will catch you later on the next video.